Abraham Lincoln once said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." While this is a quotation from the Illinois State Republican Convention in 1858, the fundamentals of this quote have applied throughout history. The Cold War tested the unity of the citizens in Eastern Europe as Western and Eastern powers fought for ideological power in these tiny countries. Czechoslovakia was one of these countries, which was tested and put in the forefront of the Eastern European battle, trying to unite its people under one ideology. The Soviet Union, a collection of regions all under one ruler, Stalin. Stalin drove for a worldwide revolution and for unity under communism. However, there were those who did all they could to stop him. Harry Truman. He was America's mascot for democracy and communism's biggest enemy. The change in attitudes from Yalta to Potsdam represented the hostility between democracy and communism. Czechoslovakia was a country that used to be a part of a German control until World War II. Potsdam and Yalta were meant to determine the control of the country like Czechoslovakia. The desires of Stalin and his plan for a worldwide revolution led for him to gain control of the Czech country. The wave of Soviet control in Eastern Europe gave America a bad feeling about the spread of communism. This is what led to the policy known as containment. Containment initially came in two ways: geographic and economic. Geographically, the Soviets have already controlled the Soviet land using the Red Army occupation from 1945 to 1947. This allowed them to place their military in Czechoslovakian territory. However, economically, the U.S. was a much more powerful country at this time. They set forth the Marshall Plan, which gave economic aid to any country in order for them to rebuild. This is the idea only, but the world already knew about this. The Czechoslovakians got word of dollars being given to rebuild, and part of the government hopped on the bandwagon. Heck, who wouldn't want free money? Yet a common philosophy of economics is that nothing is free. The Soviets figured this out and realized that the reason why Americans were giving out aid and money was so that they can gain influence in European countries and spread democracy. Revisionist theorists would call this one of the factors that attributed to the Cold War, and Soviets, they call this dollar imperialism. The Soviets could not let this go without their say on matters. They spread propaganda around Czechoslovakia and condemned the U.S. for using dollar imperialism. This led to many communist leaders to oppose their brothers and sisters in government for accepting the Marshall Plan. Strikes and protests broke out in Czechoslovakia. President Beneš tried to keep unity and order in the country. However, his aspirations were demolished in February of 1948. The Communist Coalition decided to oust the non-communist members in government in order to relieve the country of his hope to follow the Marshall Plan. This basically left Czechoslovakia as a Soviet nation and a communist state as a result of a bloodless coup. After it became evident that Czechoslovakia was to become a Soviet nation, Truman was worried that the USSR would completely take over Czechoslovakia. The Red Army did have occupation in Czechoslovakia after all. Czechoslovakia, however, was able to create a one-party state. Though it still had Red Army occupation, the Czechs were now in a one-party state with its own government. Their independence came from a new power in the Soviet government, Nikita Khrushchev. Was not in favor of Stalin's cult of personality and military oppressiveness of the world, and instead wanted a thaw period between the US and the USSR. The USSR was prepared to grant much of the Eastern European countries independence and instead focus on domestic rebuilding. Freedom. Finally, after a harsh World War II and a brutal rebuilding process, these countries were gaining their freedom and their own voice. Khrushchev was a godsend for countries like Czechoslovakia, and his de-Stalinization process allowed them to rebuild and gain their own voice. In fact, the Czechs rebuilt themselves better than many other countries, like Hungary for example. However, this would not last long. Brezhnev, the new leader of the USSR, the man that did not own tweezers. There was a prevailing idea that communism would not succeed because there would be a war in where the West would not allow the Soviets to be victorious. Brezhnev was out to prove everyone wrong. He wanted to show the power of the Soviet regime. He got that perfect opportunity to do so when there was a pro-democratic rallies, a series of them, in 1968. The Soviets could not tolerate this and wanted to control the Soviet satellites once again. Much like Truman created the Truman Doctrine to justify his foreign policy, Brezhnev created the Brezhnev Doctrine to justify why he wanted to regain control of Czechoslovakia. He even stated, when internal and external forces hostile to socialism seek to reverse development of any socialist country whatsoever in the direction of restoration of the capitalist order, this becomes a concern of all socialist countries. The Brezhnev Doctrine prevented the Soviet satellites from breaking from the Warsaw Pact, and Brezhnev maintained a strong Soviet satellite regime. It seemed as if the Czechoslovakians were on their way towards freedom after Stalin's death. However, the maintenance of the Soviet satellite using the Moscow Pact increased the Czechoslovakian dependence on Moscow itself. This was first economically, and they were dependent and restricted to trading only with the USSR, and this slowly led to the Czechs being completely dependent to the USSR. A house divided against itself could not stand, and the Soviets picked up its pieces and used it as their pawns.